I thought this was an easy question. I thought it was stuff that you've covered and stuff that we should have we've covered lots in class. Some of you got a sort of the angle that you took on the question was a bit interesting. So evaluate the view that governments could best reduce smoking by substantially increasing taxes, given that they're inelastic. That is a good term to think about, and that's something you really should be referring back to throughout the essay, because there's lots of ways to reduce smoking. But probably is taxes the best way to do that? And by substantially increasing taxes, what would be the impact of that? And so a really good trick is to use this wording in your essay when you go through these kind of things. So just kind of a few kind of pointers. Most of you did really well. So market failure, introducing that's the reason why governments tend to intervene. You're kind of encouraging that to start with. A graph, sometimes it could be the graph of market failure. A graph showing taxes and a graph definitely showing that it's an inelastic product is really important. And then going through, well, how effective, what likely impact is this going to have on people? And then you can think, well, actually these alternatives, so the alternatives are probably, number one, is things like advertising. It's possibly one other option to change people's opinions about things. Second things is things like regulations, either age restrictions or actually just banning cigarettes, or changing the advertising when they can be promoted. And so, the best to reduce smoking is probably not just taxes, it's a combination of these kind of aspects here, especially when you're trying to evaluate. So just thinking about the criteria for these kind of questions. This is what's called the mark scheme. So lots of you are aiming down the bottom here. So lots of you are aiming for this top kind of category, 13 to 15. And to get this, you've got to cover a few points. So you do understand the question. You've picked out the relevant terms and defined them clearly. So this case is taxes, market failure, and inelastic. Perhaps are your three big concepts to be defined. And that's what I was looking for in those kind of ways. Understand the theory, you understand the idea of taxes and how the different slopes of the lines. In this case, you really do need a diagram, and you've applied it to this case study. So that your diagram does talk about cigarettes. And possibly, it probably should be a market failure diagram with the tax on it as well. Examples, kind of hard here because, cigarettes is your example, but do you know of places that have done stuff on cigarettes? If you've done your internal assessment on this, or if you read your peers, it's a good little help for that. And then evaluation. There's different ways to evaluate. You don't need to do all of them in this kind of question. This is probably, you don't necessarily need to go talk about stakeholders here. But you do need to talk probably about pros and cons of each of the things. Advantages, disadvantages, and you probably need to cover something about, does this reduce smoking in the short term, or is it going to lead to more long-term changes in consumer behaviour? So, does that make sense? You don't necessarily have to cover all these aspects to get to the top. But that's what you do need to do. That's what I'm looking for to get to 13 to 15. So a few people did really well on this kind of thing. So just to showcase one that started quite well. Sorry. Starts here. This is a nice example of terminology. Things like allocatively inefficient, a nice word to talk about when you're discussing market failure. Socially optimal. In the case of the tobacco industry, we see a negative externality of consumption is occurring to say that the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal social benefit. Really good. And that actually links to a diagram up the top. And that's most people are heading down that kind of track. Actually, some of this part's actually really nice down the bottom. Is what type of tax is it? It's an indirect tax. Generally speaking, it'll be a specific tax that's levied on cigarettes by governments. But not many people did this. It's trying to link back to the question is actually what is the best way, and coming back to that in most paragraphs was something that a few people did, and it was really good to see. Talking about, so this is discussion of, this is pretty analysis up to about here, and then some evaluation, talking about advertising would work in the long run. Additionally, advertising could be high cost to governments, campaigns could last for years. How effective might that be? Coming across, and then a little bit more at the end about, how could you possibly ban cigarettes? Talk about black markets, and people did this quite well. Actually, it is an infringement of people's what I call civil liberties and people's personal rights when governments become too aggressive on things. And that was, I think, a very good point that some people made. So I hope that was useful at kind of highlighting what it might take to get a really good essay on that question.